Thank you so much for having me here. Again, I'm Matthew Andrews. I'm a lecturer in the Department of History at UNC. And let me start by saying what tonight is not going to be. It's not going to be me just telling stories about game after game after game in the sport of college football. That's what a lot of my students at UNC want me to do in the classroom, is just tell lots of stories. And they're surprised to find out that what I do in my classes is really the same thing I do in all of my history classes. Sometimes I teach the regular old U.S. to the Civil War or U.S. since the Civil War. And we're looking at issues of race and class and gender and national identity. But what I do in my sports courses is I use the games that a lot of people are interested in and familiar with, and I use these games to tell stories about race and class and gender and national identity. I was talking to a few of you beforehand, and I am convinced that there are a lot of people in this room that know way more about the specifics of college football in the South than I do. Know the names and know the games and know the scores. What I try to do in my classes and in my research, and what I'm going to try to do today, is kind of find larger meaning in it all. Look for the larger cultural meaning in sports, and in particular college football here in the South. So today in my courses, it's much less about competitive outcomes and much more about the social and political meaning of sports, the games we play, and a kind of a critical study of the figures we revere. And so I'm going to begin today with the end of one of those figures, one of those revered figures, and that is the legendary Alabama coach, Paul Bear Bryant, the longtime and almost mythic football coach. There was a saying in Alabama that Bear Bryant would die as soon as he stopped coaching. And it was a saying that turned out to be a prophecy. Bear Bryant coached for 46 years. And he concluded his career at the end of the 1982 season. When he retired at the end of the 1982 season, he was the winningest coach in college football history. 4 weeks after coaching his last game, which was in the Liberty Bowl, Bryant suffered a massive heart attack and died January 26, 1983. So January of 1983. And his funeral was 2 days later, January 28th, 1983. And the funeral of Bear Bryant was a spectacle. It lacked the historic sweep of the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. It did not possess the emotional hysteria of the funeral of Elvis Presley in the mid-1970s. But in terms of sheer numbers, the number of people who came out of their homes to pay respect to this man, the funeral may have been unsurpassed in the history of the South. The funeral service was held in Tuscaloosa, the home of the University of Alabama. Can you see over there? If I would like to, yep, good. And then a 300-car motorcade escorted Bryant on his last journey, a 53-mile journey to the cemetery in Birmingham. And crowds of mourners came out and stood alongside the highway. They were on the overpasses, the side streets and the bridges, all craning their necks, hoping to get one last glimpse of the hearse that was carrying their hero. One Alabama newspaperman estimates that more than 1 million people saw Bryant's hearse pass by that day. If accurate, that would be more than 1 out of every 4 citizens in Alabama in 1983. At the time of his funeral, some people suggested that, no, we shouldn't compare this to the funeral of Elvis Presley, and we shouldn't compare it to the funeral of Dr. Martin Luther King, but it should be compared to this funeral, the funeral of Jefferson Davis, the 1889 funeral in New Orleans, where there was a similar sort of massive outpouring of grief, and the numbers suggest a similar iconic status. And this is actually not a terrible comparison for reasons that I'm going to suggest later in the day. But certainly the size and the scope of this moment suggests that this was not the funeral for a mere athletic coach. Bear Bryant was more than that. I mean, clearly Bear Bryant symbolized something bigger. And so as a way of talking about the broad sweep of college football in the 20th century South, nothing I could possibly do in less than an hour, I thought what I would do this evening is try to place this moment and put Bear Bryant in context. We're going to find our way back to this funeral. I'm going to end with this funeral. But to get there, I want to explore the larger story of college football in the 20th century South, and more specifically, and again, this is what I do in my courses, I want to explore the history of race relations, civil rights, and college football in the South. Those are my three themes. It's only when considering the sweeps of these histories, again, civil rights and race relations, can we really understand, I would argue, the meaning of Bear Bryant for so many Southerners. So I'm going to begin just with a very brief history of college football, and then we're going to look at college football in the South, and I'm going to mention some of the key games that I think have political import. College football comes, many of you probably know this, but it comes from the Northeastern universities. College football was more or less invented in the 1870s, and it's Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. It's the young men at these universities that are playing the game, but the game quickly spreads throughout the nation. The first official college football game in the South took place in October of 1888 at the State Fair. They're gearing up for the State Fair. I drove right by it on my way here today. In 1888, Wake Forest played UNC. The final score was 6-4. And newspaper reports from the game, if you read them, they're pretty funny. It's pretty clear that the newspaper reporters and the people in attendance had no idea what they were watching. They had no sense of what the rules were for this newfangled game. Perhaps, I don't know, has anyone ever listened to the Andy Griffith comedy routine? His 1953 recording, What It Was football. It's a hilarious monologue by a naive country preacher who accidentally stumbles onto a football game, but he has no idea what he's actually watching. He says, "It was the awfulest fight that I have ever seen." And I like to imagine that the confusion at that first game is probably akin to what Griffith is saying in this recording. College football was not immediately popular in the South. Southerners were suspicious of football, which is hard to imagine today. Maybe not in North Carolina so much, but in the Deep South is where people are absolutely football crazy. But Southerners were suspicious of football at first. Southern ministers talked about the evils of football and the passions that football unleashed, the animalism that the game of football spawned in individuals. Southern intellectuals, college presidents, prominent spokespeople talked about how we here in the South are not going to play this Yankee game. Down in Dixie, we're not going to play a game invented up in the North. Let the Northerners play that game. We'll play other games. Gradually, however, and I'll just jump ahead to 1921, gradually football fever takes hold in the South. And by the early 20th century, and the white Southerners are very explicit about this. This is not a theory, and I'm just reading the evidence. White Southerners were making the case that football was a vital expression of white Southern manhood. Like, this is why we should play the game, to demonstrate white Southern manhood. And specifically, their argument was this. A generation, or now 2 generations after the shock of the Civil War, after the disappointment of the Civil War, football provided Southerners with a new arena, provided young Southern men with a new arena in which they could display a muscular identity, a muscular, militaristic, white Southern identity. So yes, Southern white men had lost the war all those years ago, but now white Southern men could redeem themselves. They could redeem Southern manhood on the gridiron, these athletic fields of battle, a different type of war. And there was a very important victory in the South. All Southerners took pride in this victory, it seems. It played a huge role in popularizing the sport in the South. In 1926, the University of Alabama, a university that I'm going to talk a lot about today, they traveled to the Rose Bowl in California, and they defeated the heavily favored University of Washington. This is largely thought of as the game that puts Southern college football on the map. The governor of Alabama hailed the game as proof that the South was not as backwards as everyone in the rest of the country thought they were, not as underdeveloped as people thought. A half century after the Civil War, I mean, this is the words people use, the South had risen again, and the South had defeated a non-Southern team on a different field of battle. So there's tremendous pride, not just in Alabama, but all over the South for this interregional victory. But here's the problem. Interregional games like this become more and more difficult for Southern universities to arrange. And that's because more and more Western universities and more Northern universities, they start having black players on their teams. And administrators at white Southern colleges and universities said, we're going to draw a line. We will not let our students play sports against black athletes. It's a repetition of the Jim Crow rules that were so prominent here in the South. And the reasons they gave were very varied for why this should never happen. Everything from an anxiety over black perspiration on white skin, to the fear that if you allowed black men to compete against white men, the next step, the inevitable next step, would be black men dating white women. Many viewed this as the ultimate catastrophe. This is a trope repeated in Southern philosophy and literature at this time. So in the name of racial integrity, is what people argued, no white man, no student at a white university should ever play football against a black man. But this becomes increasingly difficult over the course of the 20th century. Black athletes, and it's never a lot of black athletes, it's like one black athlete at Dartmouth, one black athlete at Yale, one at Michigan. Black athletes start appearing on the rosters of non-Southern colleges and universities. And the question became, well, what's going to happen when a Southern school plays against one of these desegregated schools? I hesitate to call some of those schools integrated. They're really desegregated. And initially, what happens is this, and this is very interesting. When Southern schools went north, they brought Jim Crow with them. They brought Jim Crow rules with them. They said, we'll travel up north, but we insist that you keep the black players, your black players, out of these contests. Usually this policy was explicitly written in the contracts that the schools would sign. It's what was known as a no Negro Clause. Though sometimes it was just a verbal agreement, but this was the agreement, this was the policy. And I have a couple notable examples that I want to mention. The best black player from the early 20th century was Paul Robeson of Rutgers. Robeson is one of the great Renaissance men in certainly 20th century American history. He went on to be a famous singer, Shakespearean actor. He was a political activist. But when he was at Rutgers, he was an all-American football player. The man who sort of invented football, Walter Camp, said, Paul Robeson is the greatest football player I've ever seen in my life. In 1916, Washington and Lee from Lexington, Virginia, they traveled north to play Rutgers in New Jersey. And the president of Washington and Lee insisted that Rutgers keep Paul Robeson out of the game. You don't get to play him even when you're on your field. And in the name of being a good host, Rutgers complied. And this is the way it generally worked. The Jim Crow rules went north. Another prominent example that I want to mention for a couple of reasons. 2 decades later, in 1934, there was a lot of anticipation for a game between two mighty programs, a northern program and a southern program, the University of Michigan in the north and Georgia Tech from the south. This was back when Georgia Tech went by the wonderful nickname, the Rambling Wreck of Georgia Tech. I have no idea why they changed it. That was a great one. But Georgia Tech was all white, that's no surprise. Michigan had one black player, just one, Willis Ward. That's him there on the right. He played end. He was their best player. You may recognize his teammate just to his right on the left. Anyone? Gerald Ford, a young, square-jawed Gerald Ford, who soon to be, not soon, but eventually will be president of the United States. And when Georgia Tech agreed to travel north to play in Ann Arbor, Michigan, they made it clear that Willis Ward could not play. There was a no Negro clause in the contract. This was the agreement, but when Michigan students found out that Willis Ward was going to be held out, that their best player was not going to be able to play against Georgia Tech, Michigan students threatened to boycott the game. The Detroit NAACP threatened to come and protest. And so there was something of a crisis before the game, and a bizarre compromise was reached. Michigan indeed did keep Willis Ward out of the game, But in return, Georgia Tech benched their star player, a white player named Hoot Gibson, one of two famous Hoot Gibsons in the South. This would let Georgia Tech keep its racial principles intact. There would be no interracial play, but it would not put Michigan at a competitive disadvantage. These are the types of deals that were cut. Michigan won the game 9-2, but in some ways we might say Georgia Tech won the larger battle because they had kept the black athlete off the field. How does this change? When does this change? Let me talk firsts. The first major Southern university to go north and allow a Northern university to play their star black players was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This landmark game occurred in 1936 when UNC traveled north to New York City to play NYU. This game was at the Polo Grounds in Manhattan where the New York Giants played. When officials from UNC and NYU agreed to play this game, there was no conversation about Jim Crow rules. There was no Negro Clause inserted into the contract. NYU had one black player. We're seeing a trend here. They had one black player, their tailback, Ed Williams. He was their star player. And the question was, would Ed Williams be allowed to play? Well, UNC was indeed a segregated university in the 1930s, but they had a fairly progressive college president, Frank Porter Graham. I'm sure many of you know that Graham is a remarkable figure. He was a believer in civil rights. He was a believer in workers' rights and racial justice. He was indeed the president of a segregated university, but he was clearly looking forward to the day when he could desegregate UNC. So when the chancellor of NYU contacted Frank Porter Graham and told him, look, we would like Ed Williams to play, and we believe that he should, because there's no Negro Clause in the contract, Frank Porter Graham wrote him a letter and said explicitly, we will play the team that you put on the field. Whoever is there, that's who we're going to play. And this is exactly what happened. UNC and NYU played. Ed Williams played for NYU. If you care about such things, UNC won the game 14-13. Frank Porter Graham, and I've seen the letters, Frank Porter Graham received dozens of angry letters from North Carolinians, from Southerners, warning him of the hideous consequences that were sure to occur because of this game. They are angry, angry letters. He did receive other letters, however, some letters of support. Someone who wrote about this game was Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. And he thanked the UNC players and coaches and fans for exhibiting the utmost sportsmanship in New York City that day. He also couldn't resist the opportunity to ridicule the fears of white segregationists a little bit. This is what he wrote in the NAACP newsletter. He said, the University of North Carolina is still standing, and none of the young men representing it on the gridiron appears to be any worse off having spent an afternoon competing against a Negro player. No white North Carolinian's daughter will marry a Negro as a result of Saturday's play. Relax, y'all, I think Wilkins is saying. One more first. A decade later, it was the University of Virginia that took what we might call the next step. In 1947, Harvard traveled to Charlottesville to play the University of Virginia, and Virginia became the first major Southern school to host a desegregated football team when they welcomed Harvard. Harvard had one black player, a lineman, Chester Pierce. The visit of Harvard did not occur without incident. There was opposition about Chester Pierce staying in a Charlottesville hotel, staying with his white teammates. Eventually he was allowed to. And the Harvard players reported that Pierce was targeted with a few impolite words. But when Pierce left the game at the end of the third quarter, it seems as if most of the crowd stood up and gave him a rousing applause. The Harvard newspaper reported that he received a tremendous ovation from the 24,000 people in attendance. So the game was played without incident on the field. This may be in part because Virginia was so much better than Harvard. They won the game 47-0. But a barrier had been breached. We could say that change was happening, that progress was occurring gradually, slowly. But then came the Bobby Grier affair, and this is the episode that I think best illustrates all of the tensions and anxieties in race and college football at mid-century. And to understand this moment, and many of you know about this, but it's quite remarkable how few of my students know about this. To understand this moment, you have to remember that this took place pretty soon after the Supreme Court made its decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, May of 1954. In 1954, under the direction of Earl Warren, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, and they ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. The court ordered that school districts had to begin the process of desegregation. Of course, in a subsequent ruling, they also ruled that desegregation should proceed with all deliberate speed, a confusing phrase that meant different things to different people. This phrase prompted segregationists to argue that they could desegregate at the speed of their own choosing, at a speed of their own deliberation. And the Brown decision is immensely important and significant for two reasons. One, it emboldens civil rights activists, right? It's a sign to civil rights activists that perhaps the federal government is on our side. But equally important, I would argue, is the fact that this decision hardened resistance in the South. The Brown decision leads to a phenomenon known as massive resistance. White Southerners, many white Southerners, dedicated themselves to opposing this new federal order that was coming from the Warren Court, that was coming from faraway Washington, D.C. As this billboard suggests, Earl Warren was suddenly public enemy number one down in the South. There were many sites of massive resistance. The New Orleans Public Schools with Ruby Bridges in 1960, Little Rock Central High School in 1957. One of the sites of massive resistance was the college football field. In the immediate aftermath of the Brown decision, there was a renewed commitment among schools in the South to avoiding interracial competition on the field of play. We've kind of taken a step backward, one might say, but that's the way people thought of it. The Supreme Court is changing things too fast. We need to draw a line in the sand, and one of these lines is going to be around the football field, and many Southerners are saying no more interracial competition down here in the South. Avoiding interracial competition is pretty easy during the regular season. Southern schools just largely play Southern schools, so that was easy. But end of the year bowl games, this is where the problem arose. Bowl games, certainly back then, tried to match teams from different regions. That's what made bowl games interesting. And so at the end of 1955, getting ready for the January 1 Sugar Bowl game in New Orleans, the Sugar Bowl committee selected Pittsburgh and Georgia Tech. Again, they're going to play New Orleans on January 1st, 1956. Georgia Tech was all white. Pittsburgh was desegregated. They had one black player, their star fullback and linebacker Bobby Grier. Some Georgia politicians said absolutely not. Georgia Tech does not get to play in this game. Georgia's governor, Marvin Griffin, announced his opposition to this game. He announced his opposition to Georgia Tech playing in this game. He tapped into this new spirit of massive resistance. He used some fire and brimstone words here. He said before this game, "The South stands at Armageddon. We cannot make the slightest concession to the enemy in this dark and lamentable hour of struggle. There is no more difference in compromising the integrity of race on the playing field than in doing so in the classroom. One break in the dike and the relentless seas will rush in and destroy us." Dramatic stuff, right? No interracial competition. I've done research into this moment. Many newspapers in the South praised the governor for his principled stand, but surprising to me, a lot didn't. And the students, in particular, the students at Georgia Tech, they rebelled against their governor. They were the ones who objected the most. Though they attended a segregated university, Georgia Tech students protested Griffin's call to boycott the game. They did not want to miss out on an opportunity to go to New Orleans on New Year's Day and watch football. I mean, that sounds like a lot of fun. Georgia Tech students got political. They rallied outside the Georgia Capitol building. They hung the governor in effigy. Here is a very interesting photograph from this moment. One that there's a lot going on here. It illuminates their opposition to the governor. We want to go to the Sugar Bowl, but it's a photograph that's not exactly absent of demeaning ideas about race. It's not free from demeaning ideas about blackness. Ultimately, the students got their way. Georgia Tech officials, they defied the governor's wish. The governor didn't want to use the National Guard to stop the football team. They sent a team to the Sugar Bowl. So what we have here, I think both in this story and in this photograph, is sort of the ambivalent power of sport, the complicated power of sport. On the one hand, Southern college football is an expression of larger ideas about race. I mean, it's part of the larger Jim Crow culture. On the other hand, football-loving Southerners don't want to be left out of the exciting and increasingly national college football scene. They want to play these games, and so boundaries were breached. When I was doing research for this, I was reading the Georgia Tech student newspaper, and I came across a letter that a Georgia Tech student wrote to the editor. I think it just perfectly sums up in words what we see here. This one student said, "I'm all for segregation until it interferes with something important, like football." You know, people will change their principles if it perhaps means going to a football game. And we're going to see that in display in just a second. So just to kind of go quickly here before I get to Bear Bryant, all three of the major Southern athletic conferences would remain segregated until 1963. The ACC begins desegregation first, and the way it more or less worked is that the schools in the upper South did it first, and then it just kind of slowly worked its way down south. The Southwest Conference began to desegregate in 1966. It was not completely desegregated until Texas had a black player in 1970. And then, you know, not surprisingly, the Southeastern Conference, the SEC in the Deep South, they desegregated last. It began with Kentucky in 1967, and then it ended with LSU, Georgia, and Ole Miss. Those three schools finally desegregated in 1972. It's a story that I could focus on. I'm not going to focus on the story of Ole Miss, but in 1963, the football stadium became a rallying space for massive resistance. 1963 was when the federal government was trying to force James Meredith to be allowed to be enrolled at the University of Mississippi, and the football games became the spaces where students and Mississippi fans didn't just root for their football team, but they came to hear politicians like Ross Barnett give speeches, you know, saying, "I'm never going to desegregate, segregation now, forever," so on and so forth. All that said, it's the University of Alabama that comes to symbolize the ideas of Jim Crow and massive resistance in the South. And to an extent, it comes to symbolize this, whether Paul Bear Bryant wanted to make those statements or not. And though Bryant was primarily an Alabama figure, he becomes a figure of immense regional significance. And actually, I'll be interested to hear if my thoughts about Bear Bryant, you know, when we have a conversation, match your thoughts or your memories about Bryant. The story of Bear Bryant is often told as a rags to riches story, but it's told in the Southern vernacular. Bryant was one of 11 children born to Arkansas sharecroppers. And so he grows up poor, right? He lives a hard scrabble life. By all reports, he was a hard scrabble kid. Hearing the nickname Bear in high school, a traveling circus came by and they dared someone to wrestle a bear, and Paul Bryant said, "I'll wrestle that bear." And then he became known as Bear Bryant. And then Bryant lives the life of many 20th century white Southerners. He's going to rise out of poverty. In his case, he's going to rise out of miserable poverty. He's going to realize increasing material success. And in Bryant's case, this success comes through football, right? That's his avenue. Bryant played football at the University of Alabama in the mid-1930s. There he is in 1935. And then he becomes a coach, and he coaches everywhere in the South. He was an assistant at Alabama, and then an assistant at Vanderbilt. He coached in Chapel Hill during the war. He was part of that remarkable Navy flight school program. George W. Bush was there, Ted Williams was there. I mean, there was just kind of a who's who of American athletes on Carolina's campus during the war. After the war, he coached at Maryland, he coached at Kentucky. There was a famous stint at Texas A&M where his practices bordered on the sadistic, although he said he was instilling honor. And maybe he was. And then he became the head coach at Alabama, his alma mater, in 1958. And as I said, he would coach there until 1982. So 1958 to 1982, a lot changes in the South. A lot changes in Alabama between those years. When asked why he returned to Alabama, Bryant supposedly said, "Because Mama called, and when Mama calls, you just have to come running." I've been to Tuscaloosa, and that is on the wall of every bar in Tuscaloosa. They really like that, that quote in Tuscaloosa. Bryant's breakout year at Alabama was 1961. This is when he made his mark. His team ended the season ranked #1 in both polls. The Alabama defense surrendered 25 points the entire season. They capped the year with a 10-3 victory over Arkansas in the Sugar Bowl. And this made the people of Alabama immensely proud, I mean, as it probably should. The day after the victory, an Alabama congressman named Frank Boykin from Mobile, he expressed his joy in a somewhat rambling letter that he sent to Bryant, a letter in which he invoked many white Southern ideas and traditions. I'm gonna sort of excerpt from it. I think this is interesting. Writing to Coach Bryant, he says, "Your men stood like Stonewall Jackson. They should now name you not just Bear Bryant, but General Bryant," so the link between sport and militarism. "I cannot commend you enough for the thrill that you and your marvelous, brilliant men have given me, my family, and our colored people that's done such a good job for us over the years. There was so much joy that you gave all the home folks and people all over the South that want us to keep some part of our way of life." There's a lot in there. Our way of life in 1961 was a well-known euphemism for legally sanctioned white supremacy. And so for Boykin, this championship team was a point of pride for people that found themselves in the midst of turmoil, found themselves in the midst of a profound social transformation, a transformation that many of them did not want. By 1961, Jim Crow and massive resistance were under attack, and they were beginning to collapse state by state. They were coming under the attacks of grassroots activists, of students who were sitting in at lunch counters. There seemed to be an emerging federal commitment to the Constitution. By the end of 1961, Alabama and Mississippi were the only two states that had yet to desegregate a single public school. And in this environment, I think clearly Boykin sees Alabama's national championship as evidence that resistance is right. This victory demonstrates that. This national championship speaks for itself. It's an undeniable proof. Was undeniable proof of the achievement and the honor and the manhood of Alabamans. This national championship took on even more meaning if you remember the fact that Alabama wanted to go to the Rose Bowl in 1961. That was where they wanted to go. They were just like they had done in 1926. They wanted to go back there. But at the conclusion of the 1961 regular season, Bryant, his players, and the University of Alabama, they expected to go to California to face UCLA in the Rose Bowl, but the Crimson Tide was not invited to go to the Rose Bowl. And that's because UCLA students raised a fuss. They said they were going to protest if the University of Alabama traveled to Pasadena. Los Angeles sports writers kicked up a fuss. They howled in protest at the thought of a Jim Crow team traveling to Pasadena. And again, it's helpful to remember the times, not just a team from the South, but especially a team from Alabama. Earlier that spring, the nation saw the photographs and they watched the newsreels, the news reports of what happened when the Freedom Riders had rolled into Birmingham. There they had been beaten mercilessly. Some of the Freedom Riders were UCLA students, and so they got up and they gave speeches and they said this team should not be allowed to come here because of what we saw in Alabama. In the minds of many Californians, the all-white Alabama football team and these violent white supremacists were the same people. And they made it very clear they were not going to be welcomed in Southern California. And sensing that there would be trouble, the Alabama administration, they agreed with the Rose Bowl officials and they agreed that it would not be a good idea to Alabama to travel to California. So instead they played Arkansas in that Sugar Bowl. There was a sports writer, great sports writer, provocative sports writer from Los Angeles named Jim Murray. And he was one of the sports writers leading the charge. And he reveled in the fact that Alabama couldn't come. He reveled in the disappointment that he assumed the people at Alabama felt. Here's how he put it, and I think this is interesting. He said, "The collapse of Alabama's Rose Bowl dream hit the South as hard as if Fort Sumter had suddenly returned fire after all these years." So I think this is interesting. We have an Alabama congressman who clearly sees this team evoking images of the Civil War. Bear Bryant is just like Stonewall Jackson. And we have a California sports writer who says this Alabama team evokes images of the Civil War as well. Of course, they think of these images in very, very different ways. And so right or wrong, the University of Alabama football team comes to represent, in the minds of many, the white South. It comes to represent the embattled white South. Bear Bryant never sought the role of defender of white supremacy. He was accorded that status by white Southerners who were eager for symbolic victories in this civil rights struggle. He was branded with that status by sports writers like Jim Murray. He did not ask to be the face of massive resistance like George Wallace did. I mean, that was one of his political positions. I'm going to stand in the schoolhouse door and segregation now, tomorrow, and forever. All that said, Bear Bryant was not a courageous apostle of desegregation either. He just tried to stay relatively quiet on the issue. Bear Bryant would eventually be the one to desegregate the University of Alabama football team. And the evidence seems to suggest that he wanted to do it in the late 1960s, but politicians like Wallace and others twisted his arm and told him that he couldn't do it. And then here we get to the unintended consequences of sports. The next and last game I want to talk about is Alabama's 1970 game against Southern Cal. In 1970, an integrated USC, I always say USC, but I realize people in the South think that means South Carolina. Yeah, so Southern Cal, I got it. In 1970, an integrated Southern Cal team came to visit Alabama. And it really was an integrated team. I mean, many of the starters on Southern Cal were African American. The entire backfield was African American. They had a great African American running back, Sam Bam Cunningham. And to the shock of many people in Alabama, Southern Cal absolutely mauled Alabama. Sam Cunningham ran for 135 yards. He scored 2 touchdowns. If you watch the grainy film, I mean, he literally runs over the smaller defensive players at the University of Alabama. Cunningham was big and powerful and fast. I like to think that he ran with his own version of deliberate speed. And the message here was clear. if you want to compete in the modern world of college football, you better consider all of the players for your squad, not just some of the players. And so it's a little more complicated than I'm going to suggest. There seems to have already been in works a plan for a black player on the University of Alabama. But this game was in 1971, and the next year, this game was in 1970. The next year, 1971, the University of Alabama had their first black varsity football player. So change happened awfully quick. One assistant coach for the University of Alabama famously said this: Sam Cunningham did more for integration in Alabama than Martin Luther King did in 20 years. That's not an accurate statement, in my opinion. I think Martin Luther King Jr., Diane Nash, Fred Shuttleworth, or any number of the participants in the Freedom Rides probably did a little more than Sam Cunningham, although maybe not. At the very least, this statement attests to the symbolism, the important symbolism of this game. And over the course of the 1970s, the Alabama football team, like the university itself, like all Southern universities, much more generally, became increasingly integrated. And so this is why, to go back to the funeral, at Bear Bryant's funeral, that the pallbearers, some were white, some were black. In the crowd, you had many white players who had played for Bear Bryant. You had black players as well who came to mourn the passing of their coach. In the last decade of Bear Bryant's life and coaching career, he was coaching integrated squads. So what is the meaning of Bear Bryant? There's that's not C. Van Woodward, that's Paul Bryant once again. But if you're interested in Southern history, and I've become more and more interested in Southern history living here in the South, there's a great essay to read by the historian C. Van Woodward called The Search for a Southern Identity. And in this essay, Woodward suggests that in the aggregate, white Southerners share a few traits. And he's talking in the mid-20th century, obviously. Woodward pointed to a shared sense of guilt over racial problems in the South. He suggested that there was a collective sense of shame for the defeat in the Civil War, a shame that was being written about by guys like Faulkner. He pointed to a common history of poverty in the South, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, and he pointed very specifically to the importance of place, the importance of home and place in Southern life. And so I think it's interesting to think of Bryant in all of these terms. I think Bryant embodied many of these traits, but he was also seen by many as a modern Southern hero who I think transcended some of these traits. This speaks to the complicatedness of Bryant and the complicatedness of the South in the second half of the 20th century. You know, Bryant rose out of poverty, like so many Southerners did during this era. Bryant was part of the racial problems of the time, we could say, seeing over a segregated football team, but he was also clearly part of the solution to those problems. He was the one who desegregated the football team. Unlike the South's Civil War generals, Bear Bryant won most of his battles. When he retired, he was the winningest college football coach of all time. So he turned that narrative absolutely on its head. And Bryant transcended place to an extent. He wasn't born in Arkansas, but he transcended his Arkansasness. He wasn't just an Alabama figure. Again, he was in Tennessee and Texas and North Carolina and Maryland. But he never made the mistake, we might say, of leaving the South. He always remained a Southerner. So Bryant appealed to different Southerners for different reasons. We might say that he was the Old South and the New South all at the same time. He certainly seems to embody the transition from one to the other. He meant different things to different people. He meant something special to different people. Some good, some bad. But I'll end with this then. When it came to Bear Bryant, there just seems to have been something for everyone. This is why the Georgia football coach, Wally Butts, once said, in Alabama, an atheist is someone who doesn't believe in Bear Bryant. I like that quote.